Good evening, everybody. Welcome to an incredibly exciting event hosted by me, Melinda Ferguson Books, and the Sunday Times. We've had an amazing response to this webinar, and I hope all of you are tuned in for something I think that is going to be quite spectacular. Thank you, Sunday Times, for agreeing to host us, and thank you for Arena Events for all your fabulous organization. So I met Malcolm Ray in a place that probably one wouldn't expect, but well, definitely not Malcolm to be in, because it was at Old Ed's Virgin Active Gym. And this was in the early 2000s, and Malcolm and I would be on the treadmill together. We'd swap our insights about life in general, but we often spoke about our sons. And Malcolm, I remember being such a proud dad of his son, Liam. And I have two sons myself, and they were both still small, and we had a lot of talks about our children. Then I didn't hear from Malcolm for a long time. And then in March last year, in the second year of our lockdown, I got a WhatsApp from him saying he had a book that he was interested in me looking at to publish. The book was called The Tyranny of Growth. I read his pitch document, and I must say, if anyone can write a pitch document, Malcolm Ray can. He bedazzled me. His insights, the way that he posed all his chapters, his introduction, they were quite mesmerizing. And I went off to my partner company, NB Publishers, and we all loved the idea of the book. The book, a book like this, I don't know if you can see it. It's a big book. It's a big book. And a book like this is not an easy book to publish. It's not an easy book to write. Malcolm did an incredible job. He never missed a deadline. He produced amazing narrative. He produced incredible insights. But books and publishing are not easy in South Africa today. So when I did get the book delivered in my hands, it felt like all of the hard work and all of this blood, sweat, and tears that Malcolm specifically put in has been worth it. And I'm really looking forward to all of you reading this book. It's a very important book for South Africa. I feel honored to be the publisher of this work, and I think it will take a very important place in our literature, in our specifically non-fiction literature in South Africa. So Malcolm, you are the man of the moment, and I really would like to acknowledge you and thank you for trusting me with your book, and thank you for your incredible work, your genius. And I hope that the book will give you the acknowledgement that you so richly deserve. You are one of the most outstanding authors in our country. You have produced a book that is relevant, that is important, and please, people, I'm the publisher, but I want you to buy this book. I'm going to tell you details just before I leave this discussion. But it is not only Malcolm tonight who I'd like to honor. We have got a world-class panel. I don't think I've seen so many doctors and professors in a virtual room in all the time that I've been publishing. So really, I've got cold shivers when I look at all of you, because thank you. I'm not going to introduce everybody. Dr. Adrian Saville will be doing the honors, but Dr. Abedian, I got your name right, Dr. Nkondo, Professor Lorenzo, Fioramonti, and Malcolm Ray, you are, I think, going to have an incredible conversation tonight. I'm going to hand it over to Dr. Adrian Saville. Before I do so, if I had to read his CV, we would spend the rest of the evening listening to his achievements and his incredible experience. But what I would like to say is that he is a UNESCO laureate. He has studied at institutions like Columbia, Harvard, the other one is Stanford, should I add, and possibly Oxford as well. Professor Dr. Adrian Saville has worked in many markets in this world. He's worked in Kenya, Brazil, France, the UK, Chile, Estonia, I'm doing all my geography now, Botswana, Nigeria, all over the place. He brings he brings incredible experience to this conversation tonight. And finally, he has a professorship in economics, finance, and strategy at Gibbs. Adrian is clearly a very clever man. Everyone in this room, very, very clever people. And with that, I'd like to hand it over and wish you all the best.
Melinda, thank you for that flattering introduction. I trust I can do it justice. It's a great pleasure and privilege to host the conversation this evening between us, the author Malcolm Ray, Iraj Abedian, who needs absolutely no introduction to audiences, given his contribution to the economic conversation. Lorenzo Fioramonti, who I've had the privilege of working at his book launch a few years back, speaking around the topic of the shape and nature of this thing called growth, which we're going to spend some time getting our teeth into, and Prof. Nkondo. So welcome to all of you as panelists, and it's great to spend this evening with you.
I'm going to quickly add something, and I should have disappeared by now, but I did forget to say that the book, which is why we are all gathered here tonight, is available at all good bookstores. It is available specifically at Exclusive Books, and during the evening, as you watch, the link to buy the book, because I am the publisher and I need to do this, will be in the stream. So please support South African literature, but specifically support Malcolm Ray. With that, I'm leaving the conversation, and sorry for the interruption.
I think, Melinda, that is a very important soundbite and interruption. So we'll use, I trust that we will use this talk time to make the very strong case for why this is such a critical and compelling read, Malcolm. I'm going to start as my jump-off point with page 79 of your book, in which you are discussing Colin Clark's contribution to the debate in the literature on measuring the size of an economy. And he's just produced a book in 1933, and John Maynard Keynes, one of the grand economists of the past 100 years, John Maynard Keynes writes a letter to Colin Clark in January of 1933, and he says, "I've just finished reading your book carefully. I think that it is excellent, an enormous step forward. I hope that it is selling all right." And if I could use that as my opening welcome to you, Malcolm, I hope that your book is selling all right. As you know, I have just finished reading it, and it has been an absolutely fantastic read, making an important contribution to a critical conversation. So I'd like to start the discussion with you, Malcolm, and I'm going to go to the front cover. And the front cover says that there is a tyranny of growth. Give me the soundbite. What is the tyranny of growth?
So, you know, in deciding the title, I had to look at whether growth in itself, you know, was the problem that I needed to address, or whether I needed to describe growth, you know, in order to sort of disqualify the assumption that people might make that growth conceptually was a goal, a measure, was inherently problematic. You know, Adrian,
because this is the pursuit of all policymakers. This is a universal pursuit that policymakers around the world are pursuing this thing called economic growth. And here you come with a book that tells me I must be worried about it.
Yeah. So I think what's important here is the context in which I had decided to both give the book that title and then write it. It was as Melinda said, it was March last year, and that I began writing this book. And if you recall, it wasn't a hard lockdown, but it was certainly a difficult time in South Africa and the rest of the world in a COVID context. And the problems that had been there all along were clearly magnified. All around us. COVID was brutal. Lives were being lost. There were restrictions on civil liberties. There were concerns about excessive state power. Trade, you'll recall, it virtually sputtered, to a halt. Banks were not lending money. Small businesses were closing down. Workers were losing jobs or being put on short time. So it was a crisis that was, in a sense, there all along. I knew, but magnified and tyrannical, in its manifestation. And I at the time considered a couple of things in describing growth as tyrannical. The one thing was a kind of dilemma that emerged within or among policymakers, not just in South Africa, but around the world. And it was presented as a sort of lives versus livelihoods dilemma, which I felt was a false dichotomy. In tackling the question of that binary, I drew a sort of almost a preliminary conclusion based on post-2008 global financial crisis data that, in aggregate, growth as a concept was in a sense camouflaging what Marx called the sophistry of capitalism. In the sense that it was camouflaging the sort of social and environmental costs. So it wasn't the title tyranny in the title wasn't necessarily an indictment on growth. It was actually speaking to the social environmental costs of growth, and in tackling the lives versus livelihoods debates and seeing it as a false dichotomy.
Okay, I want to pause you there just for a second, because this it takes me right into the world of Prof. Fioramonti, Lorenzo. This is the stuff that you write about fiercely in your world. And if I could ask for your perspective on this, we've got this pursuit of growth, relentless pursuit of growth, that if we go to policymakers globally, I cannot find, well, actually I can find a country and we'll come back to it, but I am hard pressed to find countries that don't put growth as their first, foremost, primary policy objective. You've written about this, Lorenzo.
Thank you, Adrian, and thanks, Malcolm. And apologies to everyone if you hear some background noise, just because where I'm staying, there's a power outage, and I had to go to restaurants to be able to connect the internet. So I'd like to say, first of all, that I read Malcolm's book before it was published, and I loved it. I loved each and every page of it. I loved its focus on Africa, which I think has to emerge in this conversation. It's a book about Africa. It's a book dedicated to this continent, and it's a call for Africa to do it differently. To be able to craft its own development project without imitating or mocking the rest of the world, especially when those paradigms are bankrupt somewhere else. Coming to your question, Adrian, growth is the obsession of every single politician around the world, also, I have to say, of every single opinion maker around the world. The many journalists talk about growth all the time. They celebrate when there is a bit of growth. They go paranoid when there is no growth, or growth, you know, in a sense, there's degrowth. So the economy shrinks according to the growth concept. But I think it's very problematic. Our concept of growth is wrong. We measure the wrong things. We measure when money changes hands without measuring what impact that has. We consider selling drugs good for the economy when that is not good for society. We consider destroying the environment good for the economy just because it generates revenues and transactions for someone, even though we all have to pay for it afterwards. You know, for some people, COVID was a great thing for growth. You know, in a sense, for the pharmaceutical companies, COVID was a great opportunity for growth. It was a destructive experience for everyone else. We don't want to have more COVID, although some people made a lot of money out of it. But also, and here I close, growth has a problem with technology. This is also very important. Malcolm highlighted the social and environmental costs of increasing production and consumption, increasing money transactions without any reference to what is the impact on our well-being and on our economic progress. But think of technology as well. We're all now in this conversation using a virtually free online platform. Okay, so in the past, you would have cost a lot of money to go from one place to another, to gather in one single area, maybe to have very expensive systems around this and that. What I'm trying to say is that, is it better or worse if we have economies that through technology can lower the transaction costs of doing things? Is it better or worse that now we don't need to travel around the world or to make a long phone call with very poor quality but a lot of costs for me and Malcolm Ray to speak about his book or anyone else? So growth, our growth paradigm that is only based on how much money we spend and how much money we earn doesn't take into consideration that at times we can do so much better by spending less. It becomes also a drag on innovation, a drag on technology. And the economists here in the talk know very well that Robert Solow in the 1990s, ever since, have been wondering whether technology is good or not for growth. Remember the famous sentence that the computer age is seen everywhere by the Nobel Prize winner, Robert Solow. The computer age is seen everywhere except in economic statistics, because it's very hard for us to put a price tag on the fact that we use free technology to improve our economic progress. And that is not good for growth, according to our current concept of growth. And I close. So my idea is that we shouldn't reject the term growth, but we should rethink what it means to grow.
So that takes us to a very famous utterance of the US Senator Robert Kennedy, who says when it comes to economic growth, we count everything except that which counts. And one of the central arguments of The Tyranny of Growth, of Malcolm's book, is that growth has facilitated a triumph of capitalism in the West and a failure in Africa. Prof. Nkondo, this is one of your central areas of interest. And if we take the thesis of this book that growth has failed Africa, what's your take on this? We definitely have an online meeting, Prof, because you mute.
Okay, thanks, sorry.
It's not a Zoom meeting until someone does the mute moment.
Wake me up. But I think what I said in the question that I posted, one question that this book raises in a very succinct manner is what Foucault raises in the Order of Things and the Archaeology of Knowledge. Who defines growth? That's important. And also, who has benefited from the norm of growth as currently defined? That's important, because the people who define growth, who identify its silent features, tend to benefit from the norm. and so structure the economy in such a way that they benefit. According to the literature, and even according to the literature we have on growth, there are three guys who benefit from this capitalist conception of growth. They are the political, the market, and the knowledge elite. They benefit from this conception of order, this conception of growth that Malcolm Ray is critiquing here. Is an important definition. In year 2000, the World Bank conducted a study on poverty through 60 countries, but unfortunately it excluded us. The World Bank economists found out in the survey that what their economists regarded as poverty, the poor themselves didn't think so. So one has to be careful as to how these norms are constructed. In the opening paragraphs of Orientalism, so I asked the same question. The one who develops norms of growth and development benefits. And the West has treated Africa and Asia as a career in terms of which it promotes its own. That's an important, and the more immediate question here is what forms does growth take in South Africa? What are its salient features since 1994? You'll find that it is consistent with how it functions in other post-colonies, particularly post-capitalist colonies. Whether you go to Australia or you go to Latin America, you go to Nigeria, it has the same structures, it has the same configurations, it has the same interactions across class. So it is a structure, it is a kind of architecture in terms of which a global capital constructs social and economic relations. What I want to raise, Malcolm, is that why in the last 28 years, and this has been, explored, why has capitalism made space for the growth of the Black middle class? Even women, some Black women have benefited from the spaces that capitalism has provided for the Black middle class. You'll find the same thing in the US, where there are a few Blacks who benefit from capitalism. You go to Australia, there are some. Why is it that capitalism is so adaptive that it can co-opt certain elements of those who were outside the circle for many years? That, to me, is one of the questions that we should look at. Which, for example,
I'm going to stop you there, and we'll come back to you in a moment. Malcolm, a question's being put to you that I think is an important question. If you can square up to that, Iraj, you're going to have to hang on to. In my world, you're sitting quietly on the top right. I'm coming to you in a moment. So, Malcolm, do you want to take Prof. Nkondo's question, comment, and respond?
Yes, I think I know where, in my book, I tackle the question of in the immediate post-colonial period, the sort of 60s, the early to late 60s, the American administration in Washington, contrived a very deliberate strategy to construct an African middle class and an elite class, and I'm not talking here about at the level of political administration, but an economic class, and the reasoning behind that was in a Cold War context at the time. It was an attempt to almost create a buffer class, you know, in the battle with the Soviet Union, and industrialization was seen not as part and parcel of growth per se, but as an attempt to almost ward off the threat of Soviet incursions in decolonizing African countries. But I just want to sort of move that a bit further. You know, yes, you know, Prof, there has been, to some extent, in South Africa and other African countries post-colonialism, deliberate and conscious policy attempts to create a black middle class, including women. But you know, part of my difficulty with the question is that it in a sense doesn't address the very real lived experiences of people who, in a sense, at various moments in the evolution of these policies within these countries, have found themselves outside the economic mainstream. And we see this in South Africa, for example, where there's been a massive emphasis over the years on Black economic empowerment, on women's economic empowerment, and so on. And on the other side, in a sense, there's been a sort of split narrative going on here, where there's been talk about the need for growth, and then all these matters are considered to be redistributive or distributive dividends. Now, I use the choice of term split narrative because, in a sense, they're flip sides of the same coin. I would suggest to my panelists and the audience that, in a sense, the problems around the construction of not just the middle class, but an emerging Black capitalist class and women entrepreneurs, is that it has been in a context of a growth at all costs doctrine, and it's been at the expense of the glut of the society. You know, where, in a sense, the success of growth, not its failure, and you know, an example here is GEAR. I mean, GEAR, which was inaugurated in 1996. I think
by that you mean the growth, employment, and redistribution policy.
Yes,
exactly. Iraj, you can correct me here, but I think it clocked 6% in 2002. I'm around there. Am I right? That was the target set. But against, you know, in the background of that target was growing unemployment, widening inequality, and at the time a very small block of capital, of Black capital, that was starting to emerge. You know, a very tiny block of capital, and around that time it was really about elite pacting. It was less about the state being hollowed out and state capture and so on. And the priority through those years was growth. And in spite of the target being met, you know, what we had was a few co-opted individuals, a very tiny Black middle class, a few women entrepreneurs emerging, and widening inequality and poverty. So, you know, in a sense, and by the way, I mean, one can apply this to other African countries. I mean, the starkest lesson is Zaire, which I talk about in my book. You know, during Mabuta's reign, where a very similar policy was adopted, and he called it Zaireanization, which was, you know, in a sense, an iteration of Black economic empowerment. And we know what the results of that, you know, of that policy was. I mean, in the end, essentially, it resulted in among Africa's first oligarchies emerging, and a brutal one at that. So the consequences, you know, are plain to see in poverty and inequality data, and it isn't necessarily a matter. And this is a conversation that I had with Lorenzo some time back. Isn't necessarily a matter of resolving growth or its distributive dividend. I want to come back to what I said initially, that in a sense, I see this as a split narrative, but where both are flip sides of the same coin. And it's actually a question of, in a sense, addressing the a priori issues, and asking the question, why is it that distributive measures are necessary in the first place? Why is it that ameliorative measures like social welfare and grants and so on are necessary in the first place? And that begs the question of growth itself. It's really a question of not growth, but the manner in which we grow economies. I mean, are they being grown inclusively? On what metric? How do we measure it, et cetera, et cetera? I think those are the issues that we need to tackle. And if we tackle them properly, then in a sense, we eliminate the need for being. We eliminate the need for women being empowered, or very specific provisions.
So Malcolm, I'm just going to pause on you there. I'd like to come back to that a little later. And you've given us... Sorry, just hang on, Prof. I want to go to Iraj, because I think this gives us a direct line to... Well, Iraj, you make a front cover appearance, and down the bottom here it says that this is a political economy odyssey, bringing a compelling new perspective to the growth story. In my capacity as a professor at Gibbs, I could now follow this with discuss for 100 marks. What do you mean by this? What is the compelling new perspective on the growth story that you see in this book?
Very quickly, thank you very much, and congratulations to Malcolm and the publishers for getting this out for discussion. The origin of this, in my view, goes back 200 years back in economic literature and economic theory, when economy and economics became dehumanized and became secularized. Those two definitions interrelated. Eventually, really the debate goes back between Adam Smith and Ricardo, in a way. What you quantify matters, and the other one says, no, but the welfare of people matters. Ethics matter. Remember the much less talked about Adam Smith's moral philosophy was the origin of modern economics, but it became secularized, and successively, through various stages of two things happening: industrialization happening, excuse me, and at the same time, the concept of national state taking the center stage in the political economy of human life. And those two dynamics led to the need for measurement. What you measure matters. Quantities matter. How do you measure success? How do you signify or articulate the success of your nation as opposed to the neighboring nations, etc.? So the new perspective, in my view, is that we need to go back to the origin of economics. We need to recognize that economics is about humanity, is about the welfare of human beings and human communities. And welfare has got some quantitative dimensions and some qualitative dimensions. Over the past 200 years, successively, as we have so-called developed the economies, the qualitative sides of life has given way to the quantitative and measurable, if you like, secular dimensions of the economy. And in my view, the book corrects that, says, let's refocus, let's just sit back. We've got enough history, enough evidence in Africa, in Latin America, in Asia, in America. I mean, it's important, whereas I don't want to take attention from the peculiarities and the specificities of Africa, we mustn't forget that even in America, even in England, there is the 1%, 99% debate. There is a question at an incredible rate, the rich getting richer and the poor getting poorer. So the dimensions of tyranny of growth in Africa are very different from tyranny of growth in the heart of so-called industrial economies, OECDs. And therefore, the need for corrective measures have arisen differently in different countries. I must also say, without prolonging my essay as you want me, that even those corrective measures have their own problems. They have side effects because they try to correct what in economics called the second best scenario. Because you can't get the first best, you go to the second best, and the second best by definition always remains suboptimal. So in my conclusion, Professor, I say it is a very interesting and timely correction with a view that we have a lot to learn from our mistakes with all its side effects, both in the East and in the West. And in Africa, we have a lot to learn because this secularization, dehumanization of economics has then mixed in a very lethal blend of political issues, which we haven't really addressed, and economics and politics are inseparable in terms of rehumanizing the concept of growth.
Indeed, the discipline of economics for much of its life has actually been called political economy, and it's the if I hear you correctly, you're talking about the quantitative overtaking the qualitative, the mathematization, if there is such a word, of economics. And Malcolm devotes some of the early chapters to what perhaps I would describe as the hijacking of the measurement of well-being, with this thing called GNP or GDP, the single number, which is a small world gross domestic product, a small word, gross domestic product or gross national product, which measures the size of the economy. Small word, an acronym, but it has massive reach and massive impact. And indeed, the constructor of this measure of the economy, Simon Kuznets, says that we should be careful what gets thrown in, because we might be measuring the wrong thing. And he takes offense to measuring military spend, for instance. Yet, come World War II, military spend is in, and the pursuit of growth, military spend, and big government is on. That is supposed to be a discuss moment. That was, someone should be thumping the table. Lorenzo.
Yeah.
Prof. Nkondo.
Yeah, thanks. Just to follow up on something, Malcolm, something that has haunted me as I read through your book and the book that you wrote a few years ago. And after reading so much in post-structuralism, is capitalism incompatible with inclusive growth? Is it intrinsically incompatible with justice and freedom? And that's the important thing, that because that's what the left, allege. That's what Karl Marx suggested, that there's something fundamentally, fundamentally unjust structurally that make it difficult for capitalism to deliver the common good. In your opinion, given the experience that you reflect, is it incompatible? That's the first. Give the second one that I thought.
Sorry, hang on, Prof. Let's just deal with that first question, and Iraj has a raised hand. So, Malcolm, your response, and Iraj.
Okay, I think before I respond to Prof, let me just pick up on what you were saying, Lorenzo. Adrian, because I think it's an important point, and I probably have a sort of slight departure from it. I think everything that Iraj has said is spot on. My thing with neoclassical economic theory, classical economic theory, and then neoclassical economic theory is that a lot of it is premised on behavioral assumptions, and I make this point in the book, chiefly that people behave in rational ways as economic agents, and I want to argue that economies economies today certainly, are really a bunch of micro-level irrationalities that result in macro-level policy rationalities. That's problematic. I think the error in economic theory and the thing that at some point, and in different countries in terms of history, the timing of this was slightly different. But I think the error is the kind of assumption and the attempt to bend it to the real world, the untidy movement of society, its messiness, to bend it to the mathematical elegance or to bend this world to the mathematical elegance of neoclassical theory. I mean, somebody made the point once that and it's a good point because it's illustrative, that in science, theory yields to nature. In economics, outcomes are determined by theory, and those outcomes, as we know, are tyrannical. And all of this based on the false assumption that there's something primal in social relations, in acquisition and consumption and so on. And I mean, there've been countless critical studies, from Friedrich Engels on the origin of the family, the working class, and the state, to more recent stuff by the late David Graeber, who I encourage people to read, actually, where he deals with debt. But in that book, he looks quite comprehensively at how power hierarchies emerged over time, that they were not always there, but with population growth, you had, in a sense, complex hierarchies, social segmentation, and class structure emerging. And along with that, you've got self-interest, greed, and all those heinous things that we're battling with today. But also along with that, we've got growth emerging. We've got competing interests. We've got economic agents sort of emerging. So I think, part of my difficulty with the kind of way in which we've been theorizing the stuff is it's almost the kind of Ricardian generalizations of behavior, something about which Kuznets had a problem, as you know, Adrian, in reading the book. He was an empiricist, and he had difficulty with that kind of those sorts of broad generalizations. And I think we're seeing the kind of errors in that thinking today, actually, increasingly more and more, with kind of critiques that ought to be happening about rational utility, maximization, and profit, and so on. I just wanted to make that point.
So Malcolm, let me bring you back to Prof. Nkondo's question. And you've created a Twitter handle for the book, Tyranny of Growth. So I would encourage people to hit Malcolm up with ideas and arguments, debate, contribution. But Malcolm, that gives me the segue to say you've got 140 characters or less to respond to Prof. Nkondo. Is capitalism capable of being inclusive? 140 characters.
Okay, on one level, partially, if we address the measure of growth, the growth metric, yes, and if we include social and environmental issues in that measure, sure, but there are limits to that. So I see, the problem that we need to confront ultimately in what I call the foundational contradictions and binding constraints on capitalism's structural limits, okay? And that relates to the allocation of wealth, what Smith saw as wealth creation versus allocation.
I'm going to be cheeky here because you're going into a Twitter thread now. You're allowed one answer, yes or no. Capitalism is capable of inclusive growth, yes or no?
I don't think there's a yes or no, but it can begin to partially address some of the bitter excesses.
I'll let you elaborate a little later. We've got some time later to come to the solutions. I want to go to each of the experts on the panel, and here's your collective question. It's the same to all of you, and I would encourage people in our audience also to send in some questions. I'm getting some coming in, and we'll turn to those questions now. So please, people in the audience, send in your arguments, your ideas, your disagreement, and debate points. Prof. Nkondo, Lorenzo. Iraj, I forgot your raised hand.
Now, very briefly, the issue of is it compatible, if capitalism incompatible with democracy, with access, or I don't want to use the term equality because that's the wrong term induced. My submission is that these terms are historic terms. Capitalism, as we understand it in the political economy debate, is the byproduct of a particular age that is gone. The same way with communism, the same way with socialism. If I ask today, communism is compatible with democracy or with human rights, well, what does it mean? Is communism incompatible with environmental sustainability? Well, it's past. I think as human beings, we need to go forward. We need to understand that the definition of economic growth in the narrow terms that capitalists used at a particular junction in time is gone, is not sustainable. We cannot live with it. I don't care whether you are a communist, capitalist, African, Latin American, South or North. We need to redefine the purpose of economics. Having done that, then we need to reinvent the definition of growth in that context as we move into. We should not, my submission strongly is, we should not continue and perpetuate historic debates that are totally irrelevant to the life of our children and our grandchildren.
These are powerful words, and it rewinds to my earlier comment on the introduction of this metric, gross domestic product or gross national product. This is a construct of almost 100 years ago, the early 1930s, designed to measure a problem that perhaps no longer exists in a framework that no longer exists. I see I've got a whole bunch of economists nodding in agreement. This is very unusual.
I don't agree. I don't agree. I don't agree. Let me make a statement. I think the point I'm trying to so let us move away from old frameworks to lived experience in this country in the last 28 years.
Okay.
Let's go back to the NDP, the National Development Plan, okay, which is liberal. In its own way, it's quite humanistic. But why is it after 28 years of the NDP, we have deepening poverty, we now have intergenerational unemployment, we have very stubborn inequalities, and now we have gender-based violence. These are not antiquated concepts. It's lived experience. So I think what I want us to do is what accounts for that. We have a Bill of Rights regarding one of the best in the world. We have an NDP based on on principles of equality and freedom and agency and inclusive participation. But why is it in spite of that? We now have on the ground deepening poverty. And that's my question. It's not ideological, it is pragmatic. Why is it? That is what I'm trying to find out.
I'm waving, Adrian.
Sorry, now hang on, Malcolm. You're not allowed to wave. Or you can wave, but I'm going to ignore you. Okay, I've got your question, Prof. Nkondo. Malcolm, I'm going to come back to you. Lorenzo,
Yes.
Why should I read this book?
I think there are many reasons why you should read this book. I think it's a beautiful discussion and analysis of centuries of reflections globally and in Africa. And I think the fact that it's dedicated to it's focusing on Africa is a massive contribution to this debate. Iraj is right. There are similar tendencies and conversations and debates and criticisms emerging all over the world, but this is a contribution from Africa, which I think is outstanding. And this is also my question to Malcolm. Africa has never chosen its development trajectory. It was either a country that was colonized by capitalists, and the capitalists and the Europeans decided what Africans' economies were going to look like, or it was colonized by the communists. And then the communists, who were not, necessarily groomed and grown in Africa, decided what it was like. Is it now the time for Africa to forge its path with homegrown solutions, whatever they may be? I mean, I'm not an African. I'm just saying Europeans have done that. North Americans have done that. South Americans have done that. Definitely Asians have done that. Are we going to witness finally a century, a decade in which Africans will say, hang on, don't sell us ideas that you yourselves developed. It is time for us to decide how we want to develop. What are we going to measure? What is the secret of well-being? Because at the bottom line, that's what economies, economic activities are all for, to improve our quality of life. So it makes me laugh when I hear, Africans ask a question: inclusive growth. So why not sustainable growth? Why not jobful growth? Why not balanced growth? When a term requires too many adjectives, you know what it means? That the term doesn't work anymore. We're trying to salvage a term that is so obsolete by adding new terms to it. So it's simply, now the question is what we're discussing and what Malcolm says in his book. Can we redefine growth? I've got nothing against the idea of growing. I mean, I love when my kids grow. I love when, the time together grows. I love when our happiness grows, and so on and so forth. But the growth that we measure, the growth that influences our decisions as policymakers, businessmen, journalists, and opinion makers, is not the growth that we're talking about now. It's growth in consumption. And that is problematic because often we get better when we consume less. Let me give you, sorry, Adrian, I don't want to take too much time. But
But I mean, what you're pointing to is growth at all cost, and it's growth of the wrong thing.
Yeah, but also, sorry, I don't want to get into a philosophical debate, but it's going beyond growth. When I say growth at all costs, we simply mean that we can fix growth and somehow, but I mean, can we do better? I think Iraj was saying this. Can we do better? Can we break free from the past? Socialists and capitalists were both obsessed with growth. When you look at Soviet economists, they couldn't care about the rest. They just cared about increasing GDP. They were fighting with the Americans, showing that they had a stronger economy simply by measuring how much they were producing, how many weapons, how many buildings, how much destruction was going on. They never asked the question, what are these buildings for? Look at China. We always praise Chinese GDP, and most of the GDP is empty buildings. It's actually massive inequality, but we praise it because we think that growth is good. And the Chinese have built buildings everywhere. For those of us who go to China regularly, many of those buildings are empty. No one lives there. They just did it because they wanted to impress us. And the Soviets did the same. So the question now is, can we do something differently? And the fact for South Africa, the fact that I'm speaking to you from an area which has a power outage, that simply means that South Africa, instead of asking, what is energy for? Can we bring energy to the people? Can people develop their own energy systems? Can we decentralize our energy systems? Can I produce my energy and consume it without having to spend money? South African government has said, no, you need to buy energy from the centralized corporation that makes a lot of money and counts for growth. And when they steal the cable, you're going to be left with nothing, which is exactly what happens every second day where I'm living now in Victoria. That's the crazy part. That's how it percolates down from an idea to policy. Rather than letting people, rather than democratize the economy, let people produce their own energy, even if that is going to have a knock on growth, because if I produce my energy, I'm not going to buy it. I'm not going to consume it, but I have it. Now I don't have it.
I've got your point. Perhaps just to correct you on one point of fact, as you talk about a company that makes a lot of money. I hope the human
is a lot of money. Exactly. Makes a lot of money for someone.
Let me try and capture, Lorenzo, Prof. Nkondo, your points. Lorenzo is saying, can we do this different? Can we do this better? Prof. Nkondo is talking about a lived experience that is at odds with the promise. Malcolm?
Yes. So to start with Prof. Nkondo, I was talking a little earlier about that exactly. And I want to answer that question, with specific reference to the way in which we do policy, actually, and the way in which we think about these things, and the need for a radically new approach to this. So, I think that part of the problem of economic policy is that it's always done. It's created this impression that it's a very complex thing, very intimidating for everybody out there. Yet we all live it, as Prof. Nkondo put it. It's our lived experience as economic agents in society. But the presumption is that because of the kind of mathematics involved in it, it's too difficult for people to grasp. And yet it's the very same people who should be, in a sense, informing the shape and form of the economies that we live in. And I think part of the problem here, historically, is that over a period of 100 years, economics has emptied itself of the stuff that really matters to ordinary people, the social stuff, the environmental stuff, the livelihood stuff. It's emptied it into the softer disciplines like the social sciences and so on. So you'd find that, Prof. Nkondo, a lot of the kind of critical literature, a lot of the radical critiques that respond to your question actually emerge not from economics. They emerge from the social sciences, And what I think needs to happen now as we move forward is that we need to look at a new multidisciplinary approach to how we do policy, how we construct it. I think that approach has got to take into consideration the dynamism, the kind of dialectical tensions that happen in societies every day, every minute, that relate to human behavior, not in the way that economics sees it as a bunch of rational human beings making rational decisions on what to produce and what to purchase. So, that would be my sort of, in a sense, 2 cents contribution to the question I think you're asking. I think it's important also, and this is something that Iraj had talked about, is that we need to move away from the assumption that everything is a progression forward. So in other words, everything that is historical is anachronistic and bad, and everything that, in a sense, it has a forward momentum to it is good. That's not necessarily the case. I mean, in the United States, and I write about this in my book, the close of the 1800s, economics didn't exist as a discipline. It was a year-long course in moral discipline. It's only later that it became a discipline in itself. The emphasis at that time was in moral philosophy, in spite of the disciplining effect of religion. And we must bear in mind, by the way, and I think a lot of people who aren't economists don't know this, that even Adam Smith, made no claims to being an economist. I mean, he was a moral philosopher. And that's partly because economics was not a discipline at that time. Now, I think, some of the good in that we need to sort of almost bring back into the present in the academy, in policy making and so on, where we start to involve or get the moral issues and the social issues and the environmental issues and the stuff that matters to people center stage. You
make a big point here, and I'm going to get the sound clip where you say economics has emptied itself of the things that matter, and that observation reminds me of Rutger Bregman's recently published book titled Humankind, where he talks about participatory budgeting. And the observation is that participatory budgeting translates into substantially improved community outcomes by having the people involved in the decision process. And Malcolm, you're making this observation about perhaps a reversion to historical practices of this communal participation could produce substantially better outcomes. I might be twisting some of your words. Iraj, you've got your hand up. Your virtual hand, then Prof. Nkondo, your virtual hand. I want to do quick questions because I want to go to questions from our participants. So Iraj, your question first.
Very quickly, I think I want to repeat that economics and politics are inseparable. It is about the multidisciplinary, intertwined nature of this. And the same way that I fully agree with Malcolm that economics has hollowed itself from all that matters, likewise, possibly a bit more, politics has hollowed itself from all that matters. And it is this unholy sort of coordination between hollowing out of two important disciplines that then answers Prof. Nkondo's question, why do we have fantastic NDP, but on the ground, the lived reality is different? Because those who wrote, they didn't mean it. They just wrote it because somebody wrote it and then they started looting. They didn't start having politics and governance and ethics and all of that. And in fact, they fought it. Likewise, the so-called capitalist corporates hollowed themselves from the ethics of economics. So the problems that comes with this, and these two concurrent processes have brought us where we are. We got a lot to learn from it, but we need to move forward from where we have what we have learned. Thank you.
Prof. Nkondo.
Yeah, just a question, just follow up immediately, Chair. Just, again, coming from lived experience, why is it, our Bill of Rights focuses on basic needs as an existential material condition, basic needs, that's what it does. But when you look at the consumption patterns of the poor in this country, if you go to the informal settlements, what drives their consumption behavior is not basic needs, but preferences. You find in this informal settlement, people are prepared to sacrifice 2 meals, live on one very, very light lunch, but buy expensive furniture and cars. Why is it in the sociology of consumption, in this country definitely, and in most post-colonies, is there a discrepancy between basic needs and preference? Why do the poor prefer taste, fashion, to having food? When we say in the Bill of Rights, food security is basic, why is there this discrepancy in the consumption behavior of the poor, not only in this country, but through most post-colonies? Why?
And rewind all the way to the 1950s and 60s, and the presidential advisor, US presidential advisor Walter Stowe told us it is the drive to the age of mass consumption and signaling your social standing with the things that you wear and the pens that you use. So let me confess, although this was a gift from my wife, if that's my if there's any consolation in that. My anxiety in this room is that we've got a group of economists who will collectively start to depress audiences. I want to get more constructive, and I want to go to some of the questions that have been put to us. And we've got a really, I think, a really neat question from one of the participants. What are the practical suggestions on how we can implement beyond GDP and beyond growth for South Africa or Africa? What can we do based on the observations, the learnings, the instruction from Malcolm, from your work? What can we do to get beyond growth, beyond GDP, for South Africa, for Africa? Let's be optimistic economists, not naive, but let's be optimistic. What can be done?
Optimistic is difficult. Adrian, I know where you're going with this. There are practical things that we can do. I think the first thing is what's needed is a kind of consciousness of self. I think a sort of communitarian approach where individuals develop a consciousness of self, and these are simple things. It's not a matter of becoming an activist in a large organization and taking to the streets. It's simply a matter of exercising simple choices based on what you know about what is going on around you. Choices that relate to what you consume as a producer, as a person in industry, choices that relate to what you produce and how you produce it, and so on. Doesn't necessarily require the heavy hand of government and policymakers. In a sense, we can incrementally start to change the society and the way in which we relate to each other by changing our behavior. And I'm not necessarily advocating behavioral shifts as an absolute solution to all of our problems. But it is a starting point, and it can be the beginning of a new form of activism, in a sense.
Do you think localization could be a component of this?
So, by localization, my trouble with that is it kind of creates notions of delinking. I get what that means in the sense in which you relate it. And I get what that means in current policy. But I don't think that the solution lies in localization. I actually think in one sense that localization is a cop-out for some of the problems that we actually, in other words, our failure to actually become part of a larger regional and African community, is something that we ought to be addressing. And I mean, I've got my own critiques about what's going on in the Africa Free Trade Agreement and that's been set up and so on. I don't think that and the direction in which they're moving is a solution. In fact, I think it's a problem. But to suggest that localization is a solution, for me is actually the opposite. I think it's a problem.
Okay, so I'm going to take small behavioral shifts as a possible positive or more constructive shift, and I'm not going to be seduced by localization. I'm going to look elsewhere, and I'm going to go to Dr. Iraj Abedian, who asked the question to you, Malcolm, can we do different? Can we do better? Iraj, I'm going to ask it back to you. Can we do different and can we do better?
Definitely. I believe we can do different, and not that we can, we have to. We have almost no choice. It's a question of how quickly we do it.
So shift me to the constructive. What needs to change?
Constructive, that's the starting point of constructive change is to redefine growth. That is not just the way it's historically measured. We need to bring different matrix into this multi-pronged calculation of what Lorenzo would call it national well-being, national happiness, national welfare. I actually don't care whatever term that is, as long as the components are covered. And remember UNDP, to your previous point, that I think Lorenzo made, that whenever you have to put an adjective in front of growth to make sense of it, then you have a problem. Now, UNDP a few years back started putting a whole lot of indicators, human development indicators of education, health, kilometers of roads, dam, this, that, and the other, in order to make up for the deficiencies of the definition of growth. Now we got to say, okay, we've experimented with that too. That was a good thing. So what do? We redefine not growth as we understand it, GDP. We agree on a new term, which may be the national development indicator, national welfare indicator, national something that we agree on, which is not just growth. Secondly, and in that we have human indicators. Remember, economics is about human welfare. So it's a question of maybe not only those who are educated, but the quality of education. So we have a section on education, a section on health, a section on infrastructure, production, food security, etc., etc. And in measuring those, we then net out the adverse effect or the negative externalities. It's no good to create so many generators of electricity, but at what effect to the environment? What are the adverse effects? It's no good to have so many policemen, but at so much brutality in it, and so on and so forth. So, and we have enough history of each of these indicators in order to create a composite new measure of what our human development at a point in time is and how we move it forward. That
the mountain kingdom of Bhutan was one of the first to move in this direction, where they replaced or displaced the measurement of economic growth with measurement of gross national happiness. And this seems rather, abstract or outlandish to measure the happiness of a country, but on closer inspection, we find that happiness can indeed, if not be exactly measured, it can be approximated by the strength of relationships, leisure time, the health of the environment, time spent in counseling, with spend on drugs for depression, etc. There are lots of ways in which we can actually assess social, national happiness, well-being, progress. Lorenzo, this is close to your heart. Let's shift us into a constructive mindset.
Yeah, I'm in agreement with Iraj. Just one, I'd like to underline the difference between happiness and well-being. I mean, I've got nothing against happiness, but happiness is very personal. I don't think the state has to tell me how to be happy, but the state can tell me economic policy is to increase your well-being. Well-being is much more objective, right? Your well-being is about accessing what you need. It's about living healthily. It's about having your basic needs, as Professor Nkondo was saying, covered. It's about increasing your capabilities, Amartya Sen may say, right? So I think, and the good thing about Bhutan, those of us that have been working with the government of Bhutan know very well that they call it gross national happiness because it's fashionable, right? People pay attention to happiness. But when you look at what they measure, they actually measure well-being. They measure concrete things. They don't measure, how you feel. It's not, they don't ask you a question, how do you feel today?
Do you
they
feel
measure
7 today? Yeah.
Exactly. They measure questions like how many kids go to school. They measure questions like how much time you spend at home, work-life balance. I mean, they measure the health of the environment, all things that we would agree with. You don't have to be a Buddhist to appreciate that thing. So I think this is what tells us that well-being, despite our cultural differences, the concept of well-being travels quite well across cultures. At the end of the day, the basic elements are agreed upon whether you live, in South America or in East Asia. And I think that has to be the way forward. I completely agree with Iraj. For as long as our governments are pursuing GDP growth, they're going to do what we don't want. They're going to create, in South Africa, they're going to build a shopping mall every 500 meters, because that is growth. They're going to build new big plants, energy plants, rather than letting people produce their own energy, rather than letting small and medium enterprises thrive. I mean, I'm impressed at how few small and medium enterprises you find in this country and how many shopping malls and big corporations you find. And again, that's also an obsession.
Hang on. So this is a great point to get a question from our participants, and I'm going to put this question to each of you. Same question, your personal individual responses. Lorenzo, you've already given a sense, but here's the question: do you think that the provision of grants, of basic income grants or social welfare grants, removes entrepreneurial spirit? We know it contributes to GDP. Does it remove entrepreneurial spirit?
I don't think it does.
Twitter-sized responses from each of you, because I've got a couple of questions.
No. To be an entrepreneur, listen to this. Let me do the tweet. To be an entrepreneur, you need to have a safety net. To be a risk taker, you need to know that if things don't go well, you're not going to die. So it's exactly the opposite. If you do it well, if you create a safety net, you increase entrepreneurship.
That's your tweet. Malcolm. Dishing out social grants kills entrepreneurship, yes or no?
Entrepreneurship ought to be eliminating the need for social grants. If that makes any sense.
That's a big tweet. That's a cool tweet. Prof. Nkondo.
Well, social grants on their own are not enough, but we've got to find a way in which we can empower our people with the necessary kind and level of skills they need, okay, to participate in the economy. Social grants, unless you begin to empower, to reskill the people, it's going nowhere. It's short-sighted and it goes against the whole question of agency. Thank you.
Iraj?
Yeah, I also believe at the level that social grant is talked about as 350 Rand per month is just survival, below survival. So it doesn't enter the realm of entrepreneurship to either accelerate it or decelerate it. So the fact that somebody, as the president says, opened the ice cream shop is really quite an odd one out and had nothing to do with social grant. I bet that money came from somewhere else because he has safety net somewhere else. So I think to relate the two in my mind is belittling the importance of entrepreneurship, belittling the importance of human dignity and the promotion of human creativity, which is at the heart and element of well-being. We need to promote that. And social grant doesn't even come onto that planet. It's planet different.
There's some lovely questions coming through here, so please keep sending them through, our participants. Question, do Malcolm and the panelists believe that South Africa should pay more attention to exporting value-adding products and services and choose them using ESG criteria? Wow. Everyone's been stunned into silence.
No, I'm very passionate about this issue of that. The first answer is yes. The second answer is that ESG, we need to, that brings us to the type of energy that we have, the sustainability issues, the operation of our ports, rails, stopping the trucking and destruction of the environment. It requires, it's a very simple question, but it's a very exciting question. And the answer is yes. And the good thing, and this not only about South Africa, the whole of Africa, I would argue, this is where the opportunity is. If we're talking about how do we define South Africa's own development well-being indicator, we got to pay more attention to ESG. That is where we have comparative advantage with respect to the other regions of the globe. But hell, we need the government to understand these things and stops politicking, nonsensing, and delaying progress.
Prof. Nkondo?
I just want to, one question that I want to pose, which is, with this complex condition in which we are, where should we begin? I think to me, it's not just a philosophical question. It's practical. Where should we begin? The first one. Who should begin this? And whom should he consult? Just now we are talking about change. But only the elite, is engaged in this. How do we involve everybody who is going to be affected by our policies and strategies? How can we mobilize everybody to participate with experts on this issue? What we're doing just now is high-level discourse, but we must find ways in which experts and the lay public effectively come together to work out ways out of this mess. That to me is a very, very important question. We have been talking about this for years. Talk of populism, the people shall govern, the sovereignty of the people, but there's no practical implementable strategy that we've come about in 28 years. There's where we should begin. Who should begin, with whom, and why? The second question that I want to let them raise another question is whether, and this has been raised by the left,
right?
Whether inclusive growth, let me just complete that, whether inclusive growth can be achieved within a nation state in a globalizing economy. Can we do it in South Africa alone? Is it possible? The left says no. Thank you.
You get a big thumbs up from Iraj. Malcolm, where should we begin? This is a great question.
I think, what do you mean when you say where should we begin? Begin what?
Well, the change process.
The change, yeah. This is Prof. Nkondo's question. Where do we begin?
Process,
Yeah, look, I mean, Adrian, the thing is, I think some of the questions are so close that it doesn't allow me to articulate. Where to begin is a hell of a closed question. I've got a critique that I think would be wasted if I don't put it in the little time we have left. Where to begin? It's a complex issue. I mean, Iraj would know, and we've discussed this at length at various points in time, that we face a very complex economy, not just here but in the world. Sectoral reconfigurations that are happening. We've got institutional misalignments on top of that, because we've got policies that are outdated, that don't respond to real changes occurring on the ground, and as a consequence of these misalignments and misallocation of incentives and our tax structure and systems, etc. We've got escape FDI happening. We've got flight capital going on. We've got investment strikes going on. We've got very little value-adding FDI coming into the country. We're not capturing value in that sense, and we've got all the collateral consequences of that socially and environmentally. But where to begin actually is not a simple question of making growth more inclusive at a policy level. It's fine and well talking about these things, and the World Economic Forum has been going on about this, especially during COVID lately, about inclusive growth, about sustainable development, even multi-stakeholder collaboration, etc., or multi-stakeholder capitalism. These are all sort of policy solutions that have been bandied about in the COVID context and post 2008 context. My trouble with all of this is why talk about inclusive growth? Iraj was talking about adding adjectives in front of terms, and you add an adjective in front of a term when there's something fundamentally wrong with the term. And I want to move the needle a bit and maybe set the cat among the pigeons, at the tail end of this discussion. And that is that, I think that part of the way in which we tackle this, and we ought to tackle this, and this is a very practical thing, because of its theoretical implications, is I think we need to put critique at the top of the agenda. We can't leap to solutions if we don't really, we're all talking about things like new growth metric, etc., etc. But we haven't begun to figure out what that means. And we haven't begun to present critiques for and against it, or middle ground positions, or whatever, and we haven't begun to fathom, really, the multiple lenses through which we can actually look at just this thing, So I think the starting point, Adrian, ought to be the absolute necessity for critique, and I've got my own critique, and I think the kind of thing we're talking about here, and the kind of thing that I've talked about in the book, which relates to my critique of growth, has its own limitations, and it's actually a minimalist departure point or redefinition of growth. It doesn't, and I said this before, address the kind of foundational contradictions of wealth creation and value circulation or distribution. There are problems that we need to tackle, but we need to ask ourselves whether we should be talking about growth at all costs, or whether we should actually be talking about profit at all costs. These are issues, and I think that the notion of profit at all costs goes to the very foundation of wealth creation. It goes to the very foundation of the organic composition of capital. Marx was brilliant in this regard. he basically, in a sense, saw what he called the sophistry of growth embedded in the very process of actually creating wealth, the difference between wages and profit, and the way in which that's masked, in the process of exchange value. These are things we need to boldly tackle, as difficult as it is, and as much as some of us may have arguments against that kind of thinking. It doesn't take away the need to actually put it on the agenda and address it, because otherwise we're simply moving the problem around. We're moving the problem around, and we're moving over the foundational contradictions that I think lie at the core of some of the questions that we need to be asking honestly at this point in time, when I think we really do face a major civilizational and existential inflection point.
I think that is a very, very robust response in cracking open my closed question. And it's a clear observation, or a clear call to Prof. Nkondo's suggestion of where do we start? Well, we start by squaring up to the problem with a robust, I'm overusing the term, but I think it is the right term here, a robust critique instead of pushing the problem around. We, believe it or not, we come to the end of 90 minutes of discussion, some disagreement, some debate, some conversation. I was asked the question today, what caused me to get into economics? And my short response was, I fell in love. It is an absolutely fascinating discipline. It is a critical conversation. It is a conversation that has the prospect of bringing win-win outcomes. And your book takes us into that conversation. It is informed, it is informative, it's readable, it's digestible, it's intelligent, it's wise. I want to congratulate you on an important piece of work to come out of South Africa. And I want to urge the hundreds of people who are on this event this evening to get into bookstores and to support this contribution. That's my take on why people should read this book. I want to ask each of the panelists for their take. Iraj, you've had one go, you get another go. Prof. Nkondo, you can't ask a question. We've got 3 minutes left. Why should I read this book?
If I may go, I think we should read, and I've read it, and we should read it again, because this is the start of changing the path that at the moment is causing so much problem. If you want to change direction, you got to think which direction you want to go, and redefining growth is a perfect start. Start reading the book and get involved. That's how we start change. Thank you.
Thank you, Iraj. Prof. Nkondo, can I come to you? Unmute. Unmute.
It's one thing, Chair, to change structure, to reconfigure systems. I will try to do tonight in a lot of literature. To me, the burning question is how to change behavior. Because you can change structures I've done for some time now without changing behavior. You can read the whole of Karl Marx and be a Marxist. But when it comes to behavior, you can run your department like a tribesman. So this disjuncture between structure and behavior is something we must look at very, very carefully. Thank you.
Thank you, Prof. Lorenzo, why must I read this book?
You need to read it, and you read it, but those following us must read it because it's the most compelling African contribution to this debate, and I think it was much, much needed. And changing behavior, in my view, can only begin by getting informed, understanding how much rubbish we're fed every single day, understand that our politicians don't have a clue about what they want to do. They don't even know what to do tomorrow. They're simply imitating others that are imitating others. And at some point, someone has to say, stop. Now we need to do something differently. It may come from one of the readers of Walkel, may come from one of the students at Gibbs. Everything we do every single day in this regard has a major impact. Often we don't even know.
Thank you. Malcolm, here is your advertorial. Why do we read this book?
So that it sells. No, I think given that this is my advertorial, I think it's probably important to tell people out there why I wrote the book in the first place. It wasn't just at an academic level that I wanted to pitch this narrative, which is why I sort of brought it down to a narrative reading of what is a very complex issue. I wanted it read and as widely as possible, and part of my reasoning and I think the goal there was to change minds, right? Firstly, and if not, then at least to get a conversation going, and in a sense to start to sort of shift as Iraj put it, to shift or to decenter the conversation from old tired arguments to new ones based on an old reality that's taken on a new form and that's getting worse by the minute. Right. So my appeal really is for people to sort of read the book because it articulates in a very simple way an entire history of growth and explains through that kind of that narrative journeying, how we got to be in the mess we're in. It's intended to kind of almost bring clarity to a lot of the mythology, and that's the word I was looking for, a lot of the mythology that has shrouded the world we live in today. So I'm hoping that it demythologizes, right? The sort of the growth doctrine, and that it sheds at least a bit of light on some of the possible ways in which we can move the conversation out of the present rut that we're in. It's almost like kind of, in a sense, through the book, getting readers, it's almost like an onion, getting readers to journey back with me to the core of the onion, right? And then dissecting the onion allows us to sort of almost get back to the outside in order to understand the core. So it's a lot like telescopy, it's sort of going back in time and coming back again, and that's what the book is intended to do.
I want to borrow unashamedly from Iraj's words, and he describes this as a compelling new perspective. Having read the book, I could not agree more. Absolutely compelling. And belonging to the discipline, I want to thank you for this contribution, Malcolm. I want to thank all of the viewers for watching, for people for their participation and sending in questions. To each of the panelists, Prof. Nkondo, Dr. Iraj Abedian, Lorenzo Fioramonti, and Malcolm Ray, thank you for your time, your insights, your observations, your arguments. To Melinda Ferguson Books for partnering with Sunday Times in this event, the Tyranny of Growth book launch. Thank you for all of your contributions and your time this evening. It's been a pleasure to host you.
Thank you.